Dr. Spencer, welcome back to the White Tiger. It's wonderful to have you here, and thank you for those of you who have subscribed to the White Tiger. This is part 2 of the Foundation series, and just a reminder that the Foundation series is written sequentially, so it builds upon itself, it builds upon the information offered in the prior sessions. So it is most advisable to watch it in order first, and then if you want to come back and spend some time with each section, you're welcome to do that. But it's just advised that you go back and see part 1 and a pause, a reflection, and the path to psychological freedom prior to spending time with this particular video. That being said, you don't have to, but it is just strongly advised. Today we will talk about something we started to discuss in the post. We started talking about attachment, and attachment is a very big topic. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time navigating through attachment through the Foundation series. This component really looks at the physiology, the fundamental basic pathophysiology, or the physical component of how things function in the brain and how that leads to issues with attachment. So we're going to start with just looking at the brain itself in a very basic way. Looking at the brain from an evolutionary standpoint, the brain develops in basically three phases, and you'll often hear it called 3 brains. And by the way, I have no drawing skills, so fair warning. The first brain is your low brain, and it is called the reptilian brain. And the reason it's called the reptilian brain is because not a lot of thinking goes on here. This is very reflexive or reactive. And here is where fight, flight, and freeze live. So this part of your brain is very, very critical for survival. The second brain that evolved, second component, next level, is called the limbic brain. And limbic just means emotions or emotional brain. Now, we have survival and we have emotional response. And we still haven't gotten to the cortex. So the next layer is the cortex. And this is called your thinking brain. So hold that thought that the thinking brain came online last, and that emotions and fight, flight, freeze are engaged, not needing the thinking brain. So thinking brain, emotional brain, and reptilian brain, where fight, flight, and freeze live. So those are the 3 quote-unquote brains that you have. So they function in this, they were brought online in that order. Okay, now you're born. So let us put you here. And whoever your caregiver or provider is, we'll put them here. Don't say I didn't warn you about my drawing. As you develop this relationship, which begins at birth, there is this constant assessment that goes both ways. Both ways. That assessment is, are you going to keep me safe? So, are you going to not keep me safe or are you going to put me at risk? Which is to say, are you going to scare me? Right? So every relationship from birth is doing a safety over a risk assessment at all times and in both directions. So the baby is looking to the provider to keep them safe. Are you safe? Are you not safe? But the provider's also doing that to the baby or to the child. And you think, how can that be? Well, sometimes the child represents a risk to the provider, possibly on a psychological level, meaning, are you taking attention away from me? Do I feel like I can't devote the psychological energy to you? So those types of things factor into, is the infant or the child a risk to the provider, as well as the provider being unsure of themselves. I'm not sure I can do this. I'm not sure I know how to do this. That also goes back and forth between the two entities. So as this exchange occurs, and in that exchange, there is learning, right? The second we are born, we start to learn. And the learning also goes both ways. In that learning process, what we're learning is how to regulate our emotions. So in the written post, when we talk about the book that Dr. Shore wrote called Affect Regulation, affect is a fancy name for emotions. There are some nuances there, but not important. So emotional regulation. And where do the emotions come from? What are the emotions? What do they look like? They come from your central nervous system, right? Right there it is. Emotional brain, fight, flight, freeze. Now, there's all kinds of theories and language that we're not going to use here. What we're going to do is break it down into the two most fundamental parts. And those two most fundamental parts is that your brain, your nervous system, responds in one of two ways to everything, to absolutely everything. You will either respond with your sympathetic nervous system, which is fight, flight, freeze, or your parasympathetic nervous system, and this is your calm and relax nervous system. So depending on what is happening in this exchange, either fight, flight, freeze is being evoked, or calm and relax is being evoked, or if fight, flight, freeze is evoked, the care provider or the caregiver or the provider will mitigate that and make the infant or child feel safe, and that precipitates emotional balance or emotional regulation. Now, if that doesn't happen, and the child continues in fight, flight, freeze, then that becomes the way that they perceive the world, including their care provider. In other words, you're not going to make me feel safe. So that's a problem. So fight, flight, freeze is only the only place where you experience this, right? Fear. So you are hoping that your care provider will balance your fears, risk, with calm and relax, safety. This is the only place where you feel safe. This is where you feel risk. So, an example would be for a child or child or infant who feels not safe is a child or infant who can't connect with their provider. And let's use the example of somebody who's depressed. When somebody's depressed, they can't exchange emotionally. So the child's left feeling kind of confused and vulnerable, which induces fear. And then fear induces this. And in the words of Dr. Kathleen Wheeler, anxiety is the mother of all psychopathology. If you're in calm and relaxed and you feel safe, you do not feel anxious. Anxiety always goes back to fear, always goes back to fight, flight, freeze, always goes back to safety over risk. Let's think about this as an adult. Great example. You walk into a room full of strangers. Every person you meet, you are doing a safety over risk assessment. So when you go to shake somebody's hand, you're doing an am I okay, are you okay, safety over risk assessment. If you walk into a room full of strangers, you are scanning for connection, possible connection, or avoiding a connection. So let's give an example. You scan the room and you see this matronly elderly woman who smiles at you pleasantly. Safe. Go there. You see somebody in the room, male or female, who looks at you and then immediately looks away. Risky. Not safe. We do safety over risk with every human relationship that we engage in. And the way that we navigate that is the way that we learned it here. So this relationship becomes a template for how we navigate future relationships, good, bad, or indifferent. So what do we do if we had a situation where we couldn't make a good attachment and now we struggle with this entity here? That's where we get into issues with needing psychiatric intervention. Now, what we tend to do as a society is try to navigate it ourselves. And the issue is, this is not your thinking brain. This is part of the 90%. This is not your thinking brain. This is also part of the 90%. Why can't I control my emotions? Because they're not part of your thinking brain. So we as a society have tried to use a top-down approach to our psychological issues, trying to outthink things over which we do not have control. Because they are hardwired for this survival. You must have fight, flight, freeze be the first nervous system to assess the room. Because that means you can have a chance of survival. So you are always scanning for risk. That is part of the process of survival. Because of that, it becomes challenging to overcome issues that grow out of this. And the issues that grow out of this can be very significant, can really impede our lives. So what we want to do moving forward, and this will be the next part 3, the next post, is look at this dynamic much more closely and discuss the connection and how that transpires and what that looks like and what the components of that are much more closely, which will help to shed even more light on this issue of safety over risk. That's the post for today. I thank you so much for, again, joining us today, and I hope that you have an awesome day.